Autumn Reyes walks into Covenant Bay Medical Center on her first day, ready to work quietly and disappear into the routine of the ER. Instead, the chief surgeon mocks her in front of the entire staff, betting she cannot even wrap a bandage correctly. She takes the humiliation without a word, eyes down, hands trembling on command. No one in that hospital knows what those hands have done before. Hours later, an explosion rips through the Savannah docks, and the emergency room fills with smoke, blood, and screaming. The chief surgeon freezes in front of his first critical patient. Autumn does not. A wounded operator on the table looks up at her and whispers something only a ghost from her old life would understand. The trembling is gone. Command is not. If this story pulled you in, hit like, subscribe to Silent Badges Stories, and drop a comment telling us the moment that got you most, because the woman they mocked is about to save everyone in that building. The badge felt too light on her chest. Autumn Reyes clipped it to her scrubs at 6 a.m, standing alone in the staff locker room of Covenant Bay Medical Center. The plastic card read, "New Hire," in red letters across the bottom. She stared at it for a moment longer than she needed to, then closed the locker door. Savannah smelled like salt and diesel that morning, drifting in through the cracked window near the lockers. Somewhere past the marsh grass, container ships idled at the docks, waiting their turn. Autumn did not think about the docks. She thought about getting through her first shift without anyone asking questions she could not answer honestly. She had chosen Covenant Bay for a reason. It was a mid-sized trauma center, busy enough to disappear inside, quiet enough that nobody important would ever walk through its doors. That was the plan. Blend in, work hard, say little. Let the past stay buried under 3 years of silence and a folder that did not officially exist. The ER floor buzzed when she stepped out. Monitors chirped in a dozen different rhythms. A gurney rattled past with an elderly man clutching his chest, his daughter jogging beside him, gripping his hand like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Autumn found the charge nurse, a heavy-set woman named Priya, with kind eyes and a clipboard she treated like a shield. Priya looked her over. "You must be the transfer from Charleston," Priya said. "Reyes, right." Autumn nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Priya smiled at the ma'am. "Do not let Dr. Thorne hear you talk like that. He will think you are scared of him." "I am not scared of anyone," Autumn said, and meant it more than Priya could know. Priya handed her a tablet with the morning assignments. Bay 4, 6, and 8. Keep an eye on the kid in 6. He spiked a fever an hour ago. And brace yourself. Thorne does rounds at 7:15 sharp, and he likes an audience. Autumn had read about Julian Thorne before her first interview. Chief of Trauma Surgery. Ivy League training, 3 papers published before he turned 30. A reputation for brilliance in the operating room and cruelty everywhere else. The kind of surgeon whose name opened doors and closed mouths. She had faced worse than one arrogant doctor. She told herself that twice before she believed it. At 7:15, Thorne arrived exactly on schedule, trailed by 2 residents who walked like they were afraid to fall out of step. He was tall, silver at the temples despite being barely 40, wearing his white coat like armor. He carried a coffee cup he never seemed to drink from, only held, as if it completed the picture. He stopped at Bay 4, glanced at the chart, then at Autumn. "New," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Dr. Thorne. Autumn Reyes. Reyes." He said her name the way someone tastes something they already suspect they will dislike. "Charleston General let you go or you left on your own?" "Transferred, sir." Thorne's mouth curved, not quite a smile. Around him the residents shifted, sensing the shape of what was coming the way sailors sense weather. "Let us see what Charleston taught you," he said. He turned to the med student trailing behind him, a young man named Alvarez, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Get Bay 4's arm laceration ready. I want to see the new hire redress it. Simple wound, simple dressing. Should not be a problem for someone with actual training." The patient in Bay 4, a middle-aged fisherman with a rope burn across his forearm, glanced between them with the confused patience of a man who had learned not to ask hospital staff too many questions. Autumn stepped forward and unwrapped the gauze with steady fingers, cleaned the wound, and began redressing it exactly the way protocol required. Thorne watched, arms folded, coffee cup dangling from 2 fingers. "Slower," he said, though her pace had been correct. "Tighter on the left side." "Are your hands shaking, Reyes?" They were not. "No, sir," she said. "Interesting," he said, loud enough for the residents and 2 nearby nurses to hear, "because it looks like you have never wrapped a bandage in your life." He turned to a small audience, warming to the performance. "I have seen first-year students do this in their sleep. Tell me, did Charleston hand out licenses, or did you find yours in a cereal box?" A soft laugh rippled through the residence. Alvarez did not laugh. Priya, watching from the nurse's station, pressed her lips into a hard line and said nothing, because saying something to Thorne had cost better nurses their jobs before. Autumn kept her eyes down and her hands moving. "Finished," she said quietly, and stepped back so he could inspect the dressing. Thorne examined it, found nothing wrong, and looked almost disappointed. He straightened his coat. "We will see how you handle a real patient," he said, "before real damage is done," and walked away without waiting for a response, his residents falling in behind him like a wake behind a boat. The fisherman in Bay 4 cleared his throat once Thorne was gone. "That was uncalled for, ma'am. Your hands were fine." Autumn managed a small smile. "Thank you, sir. Get some rest." She walked to the supply closet, closed the door for exactly 4 seconds, and breathed. Just 4 seconds. Enough to remember she had survived worse rooms than this one, worse men than Julian Thorne, and worse silences than the one she was carrying now. Then she opened the door and went back to work. In the closet, before she stepped back out, she caught her own reflection in the glass of a locked medicine cabinet. A small woman in blue scrubs 2 sizes too large, sleeves rolled twice at the wrist, hair pulled back tight enough to look severe and soft at the same time. Nothing about the reflection matched what her file used to say about her, back when she had a file that mattered. Rank, unit, call sign. All of it folded away into a drawer somewhere in Virginia, sealed under a classification most people in this hospital had never heard of. She had chosen this. Nobody had forced her hand toward civilian life, toward scrubs and charting software and morning rounds with men like Thorne. She had asked for it, needed it, after an extraction that went wrong in a way she still would not let herself remember in full daylight. 3 teammates home, 2 teammates not. She had signed the paperwork herself, walked out of the debrief room without looking back, and told herself that a hospital in a city nobody would think to look for her in was exactly the kind of quiet she had earned. Quiet had lasted 3 years. She reminded herself, closing the cabinet door softly, that quiet could still last a little longer if she kept her head down and her hands moving. By mid-morning, the humiliation had become hospital gossip. Nurses she had not yet met glanced at her sideways in the hallway. A resident smirked as she passed the nurses' station. Word traveled fast in a building built on 12-hour shifts and too much caffeine. She kept her head down. Bay 6, the feverish child, needed a cooling protocol and a mother who needed reassurance more than medicine. Autumn gave both, gently, patiently, the trembling in her hands from earlier long gone, replaced now by the steady rhythm of routine work. At noon, Priya found her in the break room, unwrapping a sandwich she was too tense to eat. "Do not let him get to you," Priya said, sitting across from her. "He does this to everyone new. Broke a resident down to tears her first week. Made a nurse quit after 2 days once, for putting an IV in the wrong arm on a combative patient." "He is allowed to talk to people that way?" Autumn asked. "Administration likes his numbers," Priya said. "Malpractice suits, 0. Surgical outcomes, top of the state. Nobody wants to touch him. Deborah Crane runs interference for him whenever a complaint lands on her desk." "Deborah Crane," Autumn repeated. "VP of Patient Affairs," Priya said, rolling her eyes. "Smiles at everyone, protects no one but Thorne. If you ever want to file something, know that it goes into a drawer with a dozen others just like it." Autumn nodded slowly, filing the names away the way she filed everything, quiet and precise, without letting her face show how carefully she was listening. "I am not planning on filing anything," she said. "I just want to do my job." Priya studied her for a moment. "You are calmer than most people after a morning like that." "I have had worse mornings," Autumn said, and left it there. The break room door opened, and a woman in a tailored gray blazer stepped in, heels clicking against the tile with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned every room she entered. Deborah Crane had a smile that arrived a half-second before her eyes did, and left a half-second after, as though the two moved on separate schedules. "Priya," she said warmly, then let her gaze slide over to Autumn. "And you must be our new hire." "I heard there was some excitement with Dr. Thorne this morning." Autumn kept her expression neutral. "It was a misunderstanding, ma'am." Crane's smile widened, unbothered. "Dr. Thorne has high standards. It can feel like a lot at first." She said it the way someone recites a line they have used 100 times before, smooth and hollow at once. But his outcomes speak for themselves, and this hospital is very proud of what he has built here. "I would hate for a rocky first morning to color your whole experience with us." "It will not," Autumn said. "Wonderful," Crane said, already turning toward the door, already finished with the conversation. "Welcome to Covenant Bay." The door swung shut behind her, and Priya exhaled through her nose. "That is the drawer I told you about," she said quietly, wrapped in a blazer. The afternoon passed in the ordinary chaos of an ER, a child with a broken wrist, an elderly woman confused and frightened after a fall, a young man who had cut his hand on a fishing hook and insisted on describing the entire incident in more detail than anyone needed. Autumn moved through it all with quiet competence, the kind that drew no attention, which was exactly how she wanted it. At 2:40, the docks 2 miles away were running a routine unloading of container ship cargo, a shipment that had cleared inspection that morning without incident. Nobody in the hospital knew about the corroded valve on a chemical tanker moored beside it, or the spark that would find its way to vapor at exactly 3:17 that afternoon. Autumn spent those last unremarkable minutes updating charts and refilling a water pitcher for the fisherman in Bay 4, who thanked her again for her patience with Thorne and told her, without being asked, that most of the staff on this floor thought the man was a bully wearing a white coat. She smiled, said nothing that could come back to her, and moved on to the next task, unaware that it would be one of the last quiet exchanges the hospital would have that day. Autumn was charting in Bay 8 when the first tremor rolled through the building, faint enough that half the staff assumed a truck had backed into the loading dock outside. Then the windows rattled. Then, 3 seconds later, the sound arrived, a deep rolling boom that came from the direction of the water and did not stop echoing for a long time after it should have. The overhead lights flickered once and steadied. Every phone in the nurse's station began ringing at once. Priya snatched up the nearest one, listened for 5 seconds, and her face drained of color. "Explosion at the container terminal," she said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "Multiple casualties. Chemical fire. They are sending everything they have got. Ambulances, Coast Guard boats, and a medevac helicopter is already in the air." Autumn's whole body went still, just for a heartbeat, the way it always did when a memory reached up out of the dark and touched the present. Then the stillness broke, and she moved. "All available staff to the ER," a voice called over the intercom, calm but urgent. "Mass casualty protocol." I repeat, mass casualty protocol. Thorne appeared from a side hallway, coffee cup finally abandoned somewhere, his face tight with the particular tension of a man who built his identity on being the most capable person in any room and was about to be tested on it. "Get the trauma bays cleared," he barked at no one in particular. "I want every gurney free in 5 minutes." Nurses scattered into motion, clearing beds, wheeling in extra supply carts, snapping open trauma kits that had sat untouched for months. Autumn found herself in the center of it without remembering deciding to be there, her hands already reaching for gauze, clamps, airway kits, arranging them with an order that came from someplace deeper than hospital training. Through the ambulance bay doors, she could already hear sirens stacking on top of each other, layer after layer, growing louder, and beneath that sound, faint but unmistakable, the heavy mechanical thunder of an approaching helicopter. Autumn looked toward the doors, and for the first time since she had walked into Covenant Bay that morning, her eyes were not down. They were locked, steady, and waiting. The first wave of ambulances hit the bay doors within 4 minutes, back doors flying open before the wheels had fully stopped. Paramedics shouted vitals as gurneys rolled through, voices overlapping, numbers colliding with numbers. Burns, shrapnel wounds, smoke inhalation. A dock worker with his shirt melted into his shoulder screamed until a paramedic pushed a mask over his face, and the scream dissolved into a wet, ragged moan. Priya stood at the intake point, sorting patients with brutal, necessary speed, sending the walking wounded to one hallway and the critical cases straight into trauma bays. Thorne took the first true trauma case himself, a young man with a crushed leg and a blood pressure dropping by the minute, and for a moment it looked like the hospital might hold. Then the helicopter landed. It touched down on the roof pad with a heavy shudder that Autumn felt through the floor tiles beneath her feet, rotors screaming even as they wound down. 2 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and 4 men in tactical gear pushed a field stretcher through the ER entrance, moving with the kind of coordinated urgency that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with training. Autumn's chest tightened before she consciously understood why. She knew that formation. She knew the way they moved, low and fast, eyes scanning the room even in crisis, the particular economy of motion that civilians almost never had and operators never lost. Priya intercepted them. "Special response team," one of them barked before she could ask. "We were doing a joint exercise with Coast Guard when the terminal blew. Our man took shrapnel to the chest and a support beam to the leg. He needs a trauma surgeon right now." The man on the stretcher was unconscious, blood soaking through a hastily applied pressure bandage on his chest, his leg bent at an angle that made two nearby nurses look away. Thorne emerged from the trauma bay behind them, wiping his hands, drawn by the commotion. He took one look at the patient, and something in his posture changed, the confidence thinning at the edges. "Get him into Bay 2, he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. They moved the patient onto the trauma bed. Thorne began his assessment, calling for imaging, for blood products, his hands moving with technical correctness but a half-second too slow, the hesitation of a surgeon who had spent his career on scheduled operations and rarely on a chest that might stop breathing in the next 90 seconds. The leader of the tactical team, a broad-shouldered man with gray already threading through a short beard, stood at the foot of the bed, watching Thorne's every move with an intensity that made the surgeon's hand slow further. "You have done combat trauma before," the man said. It was not a question. "I have done trauma surgery for 15 years, Thorne answered, defensive. "That is not what I asked," the man said. Autumn stepped into the bay to assist, drawn by instinct and by Priya's hand waving her in, and the moment she crossed the threshold, something in her chest clicked into place, a door she had kept locked for 3 years swinging open without her permission. The patient's chest wound was worse than the bandage suggested, blood pressure crashing, breath sounds unequal on the left side, a tension pneumothorax building with every passing second, the kind of injury that killed faster than any surgeon unfamiliar with battlefield trauma could process in time. "He has got a collapsed lung," Autumn said. "Tension pneumo. He needs decompression right now, not imaging." Thorne turned to her, startled at being corrected by the nurse he had mocked 6 hours earlier. "Excuse me?" "Look at his neck veins," Autumn said, already moving toward the supply cart. "Look at his trachea. It is shifting. He does not have time for a CT." Thorne hesitated, the way men who built their identity on authority hesitated when authority was suddenly in question. "I am not taking direction from, sir," she said, cutting through his sentence with a calm that carried more weight than volume. "He will arrest in under a minute if that pressure is not released." The team leader's eyes moved from Thorne to Autumn and stayed there. "Do it," he said, "whatever she says." Something shifted in the room, an authority passing hands without anyone announcing it. Thorne's jaw tightened, but the numbers on the monitor were falling fast enough to silence his pride. He stepped back half a step, just enough. Autumn's hands found the supplies without needing to search for them, without the tremor that had been there that morning, without hesitation of any kind. She located the landmark on the patient's chest with 2 fingers, confirmed it, and moved. The relief was immediate and visible, oxygen saturation climbing on the monitor, the patient's chest rising with a fuller, more even rhythm. Thorne stared at the numbers, then at Autumn's hands, then at her face. "Those are not a nurse's hands," the team leader said quietly, almost to himself. "That is battlefield training." Autumn did not answer him. She kept working, checking the dressing, calling for a chest tube kit, moving through the next steps with a fluency that belonged to another life entirely, one she had promised herself she would never let surface again. Alvarez, the med student, stood frozen near the doorway, staring the way people stare at something they cannot categorize. He had spent the morning watching Thorne humiliate this same woman over a bandage, and now he was watching her call a life-or-death diagnosis faster and more confidently than the chief of trauma surgery himself. He would try to describe it to his roommate that night, and his roommate would not believe him, and Alvarez would spend the rest of the week searching for the right words for what he had actually seen. Thorne recovered enough to reassert himself, stepping back into the bay to finish the chest tube placement himself, his hands steadier now that the immediate crisis had passed, his voice sharper than it needed to be. "I will take it from here, Reyes. Go help with intake." Autumn stepped back without argument. "Yes, Dr. Thorne." But the team leader was still watching her, and as she turned to leave the bay, he caught her eye and held it a half-second too long, the way a man holds eye contact when he suspects he has seen a ghost walk past him wearing someone else's face. Outside the bay, the ER had become something closer to a battlefield triage station than a hospital floor. Every hallway held patients on gurneys, on wheelchairs, on floor mats when beds ran out. Smoke inhalation cases lined one corridor, oxygen masks fogging with every labored breath. A child no older than 7 sat wrapped in a blanket, crying for a mother who had been brought in on a different ambulance and was somewhere in the chaos, unaccounted for. 2 beds down from her, a dock foreman in his 50s gripped a nurse's wrist and would not let go, insisting through a coughing fit that he needed to call his crew, that men were still trapped near the loading crane, that somebody needed to tell the Coast Guard boats where to look. A young nurse tried to calm him with soft words that did nothing. Autumn crouched at his side, took his hand from the nurse's wrist, and held it instead. "Sir, look at me," she said, and something in the flatness of her voice, the total absence of panic, cut through his fear the way gentleness alone had not. "Tell me exactly where the crane is. I will make sure it gets to the right people. Not eventually. Now." He told her, in short broken sentences between coughs, and Autumn repeated it back once, precisely, then relayed it to Priya, who radioed it to the incoming Coast Guard channel, without needing to ask why a nurse 2 hours into her first shift sounded like she was reading coordinates off a map she had memorized a long time ago. The foreman's breathing eased slightly, not because the danger was gone, but because someone had finally treated his fear as information instead of noise. Autumn crouched in front of the crying child a few feet further down the hallway, steadying her voice into something warm and unhurried, despite the noise around them. "What is your name, sweetheart?" she asked. "Lily," the girl whispered. "I am Autumn. I am going to find your mom, okay? I need you to stay right here with Miss Priya for me. Can you do that?" Lily nodded, small and scared, and Autumn touched her shoulder once before standing and moving on, because there were 40 more patients and only so many hands in the building, and because the docks were still burning somewhere across the water, feeding more wounded into ambulances that had not yet arrived. She did not have time to think about what had just happened in Bay 2, about the words the team leader had said, about the door in her chest that would not close again now that it had opened. She only had time to move to the next patient, and the one after that, and the one after that, her hands finding steady work in a hospital that had no idea what it had just uncovered. By 5 that evening, the worst of the wave had passed through triage, and the hospital had settled into the exhausted, grinding rhythm of aftermath. Autumn had not stopped moving in almost 2 hours. Her scrubs were stained with someone else's blood, her hair had come loose from its clip, and her feet had gone past aching into something closer to numbness. She found herself back near Bay 2 while restocking a supply cart, and saw the tactical team leader standing just outside the curtain, arms crossed, watching the monitors over the shoulder of a nurse checking his teammates' vitals. Autumn kept her head down and continued restocking, hoping distance would do what silence usually did. It did not. "Ma'am," he said. She stopped, because there was no version of ignoring a direct address that would not look stranger than answering it. "Yes, sir?" He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured more than it asked. "My name is Stone," he said. "I run this team. What you did in there, the pneumo call, the decompression, that was not first responder training. That was not ER nurse training either. I have watched a lot of medics work a chest in the field. You moved like one of them." Autumn kept her voice level. "I had good instructors." Stone almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. "Where? I do not think that is really—" "Where?" he said again, quieter this time. Not a demand. Something closer to a question. One professional asks another when they already suspect the answer. Autumn met his eyes and for just a moment let something show there that she usually kept buried 3 layers deep. Then she closed it again. "I need to get back to my patients," she said, and walked away before he could ask a third time. She did not see him again for the rest of the shift, though she felt his attention on her more than once. A careful, patient kind of watching that she recognized instinctively as the way operators watched something they were trying to identify without spooking it. The hospital finally exhaled around 8 that night. The last of the critical patients had been stabilized or transferred to ICU. The walking wounded had been treated and released or admitted for observation. Lily's mother had been found 2 hallways over with a broken collarbone, and the reunion between them had been the first thing all day that made half the nursing staff cry openly at the nurses' station. Autumn was writing up her final charting when Thorne approached her, his coat wrinkled now, his earlier polish worn down by 12 hours of controlled disaster. He stopped a few feet away, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "That call you made," he said finally, on the pneumothorax. "It was the right call," Autumn said, not looking up from the chart. "I know it was," Thorne said, and something in his voice had shifted, not quite humility, but closer to it than anything she had heard from him that day. "I want to know where a transfer nurse from Charleston learned to read a collapsing lung faster than I did. I told your friend earlier, I had good instructors," Autumn said. Thorne studied her the way he had studied her that morning, except now the arrogance had drained out of the expression, replaced by something more uncertain, almost wary. "Stone wants to speak with you before his team leaves," he said. "Apparently it is not optional." Autumn set down her pen. Behind Thorne, A younger member of the tactical team leaned against the wall near Bay 2, arm in a sling from a minor shrapnel wound he had refused to let anyone treat until his teammate was stable. He had been watching the hallway for the last 10 minutes, and when Autumn passed him on her way toward Stone, he straightened up slightly, studying her face the way a man studies a photograph he has seen once before in a briefing room he is not supposed to talk about. "You are the one who called the pneumo," he said, not quite a question. Autumn nodded once. He kept looking at her, something working behind his eyes, some memory trying to surface and failing to fully arrive. "My old platoon sergeant used to talk about a medic who worked like that," he said slowly. "Called her something. Never used a real name. Said she pulled a man off a table 3 times when everyone else had given up on him twice." Autumn's expression did not change, though something in her chest tightened. "Small world," she said, and kept walking. Across the ER, through the wide doorway of Bay 2, she could see Stone standing at the foot of his teammate's bed, arms crossed, gaze already lifted and waiting for her, patient as a man who had learned that some answers arrived on their own schedule and not before. She thought of the folder that did not officially exist. 3 years of silence stacked behind her now, scrubs a size too big, a name chosen precisely because it belonged to no one anyone would remember. The debrief room in Virginia surfaced too, the 2 names read aloud that still found her some nights before sleep finally came, and the promise made walking out of that building that the next life would be quiet enough that nobody would ever ask her to be that person again. She thought of the way her hands had not shaken once since the moment the helicopter landed, and how much more frightening that steadiness felt than the trembling ever had. The overhead speakers crackled once, an announcement about visiting hours that nobody was listening to, and somewhere down the hall, Lily's laughter rang out, thin and bright, reunited now with a mother who would not stop holding her. Autumn stood, smoothed the front of her scrubs, and walked toward Bay 2, toward the conversation she had spent 3 years making sure she would never have to have. Bay 2 smelled like antiseptic and scorched fabric, the residue of a day nobody in that room would forget. Down the hall, Alvarez had found a stale vending machine sandwich and was attempting to eat it while simultaneously charting, a combination that Priya observed with open disbelief from the nurse's station. "That sandwich has been in that machine since before either of us started our shift," Priya said. "You are going to regret that decision more than any decision you have made all day, and today has had a lot of competition." "It is protein," Alvarez said, chewing with the grim determination of a man who had not eaten since 6 that morning. "I have triaged 40 patients. I have earned the right to eat something tragic." Autumn passed them on her way toward Bay 2, allowing herself the smallest flicker of a smile at the exchange, a brief, ordinary moment of normal hospital life stitched into the middle of an extraordinary day. Priya caught the look and raised an eyebrow at her. "Do not encourage him," Priya said. "He already thinks he is funny." "I am funny," Alvarez said, mouth full. "Ask anyone." "Nobody has ever asked anyone that," Priya said, and turned back to her charting, leaving Alvarez to defend his sandwich and his sense of humor to an audience of exactly no one. Stone stood at the foot of his teammate's bed, arms still crossed, watching Autumn approach the way a man watches weather rolling in from open water, aware of it long before it arrives. "You have a strange way of not answering questions," he said. "I answer the ones that matter," Autumn said. "Your friend is stable. That is the one that mattered an hour ago." Stone almost smiled again, the same tight, humorless expression from before. "He is stable because somebody in this building knew what a collapsing lung sounds like before it fully collapses. I have worked with combat medics for 18 years. I know what that looks like. I am not asking you to confess anything. I am telling you I recognize it when I see it." Autumn held his gaze without blinking. "Then you already know I am not going to say anything else." "Fair enough," Stone said. "For now." He studied her a moment longer, something almost gentle moving behind the hard set of his face. "My corpsman used to talk about a medic from a joint task force who worked triage like she had done it in a different life before this one. Small, quiet, underestimated by everyone until the moment she was not. He called her a ghost story. Said nobody used her real name in the after-action reports, only a call sign." Autumn kept her expression still, though something behind her ribs had gone very quiet, the way a held breath goes quiet before it has to be released. "Ghost stories are just stories," she said. "Sure," Stone said. "Until they are standing in front of you decompressing a chest without needing to be told the anatomy." He glanced back at his teammate on the monitor, the steady beeping a small, hard-won victory neither of them mentioned out loud. "My corpsman is 26 years old," he said after a moment. "First deployment. He watched a man he has known since basic training almost die on a hospital bed in a city he had never heard of before this morning, And the only reason that man is still breathing is because a nurse 3 hours into her first shift knew something no nurse should reasonably know. He is going to tell that story for the rest of his career. So am I. Then tell it without a name attached, Autumn said. That is all I am asking. Stone studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes that she could not quite read. Fair trade, he said finally. For now. Before she could answer, the overhead paging system crackled to life. An administrative voice reading a message meant to sound calm and failing at it. Autumn Reyes, please report to the administrative office. Autumn Reyes to administration. Priya appeared at the doorway a moment later, her face tight. That is Crane's office, she said quietly. Thorne filed something. I heard him on the phone 20 minutes ago telling someone you undermined his authority in front of a patient care team during an active mass casualty event. Autumn exhaled slowly. Of course he did. You saved that man's life, Priya said. Everyone on this floor saw it. Everyone on this floor is not the one writing the complaint, Autumn said, and started toward the administrative wing, Stone's eyes following her the entire way down the hall. The walk to administration took her past the main waiting room, still crowded with families waiting for news, past a television bolted to the wall replaying local coverage of the dock's explosion on a continuous loop, the same aerial footage of black smoke over the water repeating every 4 minutes like the day itself could not stop reliving its worst moment. A reporter stood at a safe distance from the terminal, describing an ongoing investigation into the tanker's maintenance history. Her voice tinny through the small speaker. Autumn did not stop to watch it. She had learned a long time ago that watching disaster footage after living through the disaster rarely offered anything except a second helping of the same fear. Deborah Crane's office looked like it belonged to someone who had never once treated a patient. All soft lighting and framed certificates, and a desk clear enough to double as a mirror. A small dish of hard candy sat untouched near the edge of the desk, the kind of prop meant to suggest warmth that nobody ever actually reached for. Crane sat behind it with her hands folded, Thorne standing near the window with his arms crossed, refusing to look directly at Autumn when she walked in. Please sit, Crane said, though her tone made clear it was not truly an invitation. Autumn remained standing. I would rather stand, Ma. I have patients waiting. Crane's smile did not waver, though something behind her eyes tightened at the refusal. Doctor, Thorne has raised a concern about a serious breach of protocol during today's mass casualty response. Overriding a senior physician's clinical judgment in front of junior staff, without proper channels, creates real liability for this hospital. I made a call that saved a man's life, Autumn said. The alternative was watching him arrest, while imaging was ordered for an injury that could not wait for imaging. Thorne finally turned from the window. You had no authority to countermand me in that room. I had the correct diagnosis, Autumn said, and I stated it clearly enough that the patient is alive to argue about protocol tomorrow instead of not being alive at all today. Thorne's jaw tightened. This is exactly the kind of arrogance that gets people hurt in a hospital. You do not have the training to make that call, whatever instinct told you otherwise. I have exactly the training to make that call, Autumn said, quiet and level, and something in the flatness of her voice made both Crane and Thorne pause. I simply do not discuss where I got it. Crane raised a hand before Thorne could respond further, her voice smooth and even, the practiced calm of someone accustomed to diffusing exactly this kind of confrontation without ever actually resolving it. I understand emotions are high after a day like today. But we have procedures for a reason, Ms. Reyes. I am placing a note in your file regarding today's incident. Nothing punitive, simply documentation, in case anything further arises. Autumn felt the old, familiar coldness settle into her spine, the same steadiness that used to arrive right before a mission briefing, when feeling anything at all became a luxury she could no longer afford. Understood, she said. Is there anything else? There is one more thing, Crane said, glancing down at a printed memo on her desk. Given the unusual nature of your intervention today, and some questions about your prior employment records from Charleston General, we would like to schedule a more thorough review of your credentials next week. The words landed carefully, deliberately, the kind of sentence built to sound procedural while actually being a threat. Autumn understood immediately what Crane was really saying. Someone had started asking questions about the gaps in her file, the places where a real transcript should have existed and did not. Charleston General will confirm my employment, Autumn said evenly. I am sure they will, Crane said, her smile never faltering. It is simply routine, given the circumstances. Of course, Autumn said, giving away nothing. Whenever is convenient. She left the office without waiting to be dismissed, her pulse steady, her hands steady, though the coldness in her chest had sharpened into something closer to alarm. A credentials review would eventually reach a dead end that led somewhere she could not control. A locked door with her old life waiting behind it, guarded by classifications that no hospital administrator had the clearance to open, and that would raise more questions the moment they failed to open it. She had almost reached the elevator when the first alarm began to sound, different from the earlier mass casualty alert, a longer, more insistent tone that made every staff member in the hallway freeze mid-step. "Attention," the intercom said, its calm voice straining at the edges. "This is not a drill. All units. Secondary hazard alert from Savannah Fire and Rescue regarding the container terminal incident. A second chemical storage unit has been compromised. Evacuation advisory issued for all structures within a 2-mile radius, including this facility. All non-ambulatory patients are to be prepared for transfer. Repeat, this is not a drill." For one full second, the hallway went utterly silent, every nurse, every resident, every visitor absorbing the sentence at the same moment. Then the silence broke into motion, and the hospital that had barely finished catching its breath from the first disaster began bracing for a second one. Nurses abandoned half-finished charting and rushed toward assigned evacuation stations. A resident dropped a stack of folders that scattered across the floor and did not stop to gather them. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor alarm blended into the general chaos, indistinguishable at first from the panic itself. Visitors in the main waiting area rose in a single confused wave, some heading for the exits, others frozen entirely, waiting for someone in a uniform to tell them what to do. Autumn's mind, for one brief and disorienting moment, split cleanly down the middle of her two lives. Half of her registered the announcement the way any exhausted nurse would, a logistical nightmare stacked on top of an already impossible day. The other half, the half she had spent 3 years trying to bury under scrubs and quiet routine, was already calculating exits, load-bearing walls, wind direction, the fastest path to the most vulnerable patients in the building. She did not choose which half to listen to. She simply moved, the decision already made somewhere beneath conscious thought, her feet carrying her toward the stairwell before her mind had finished processing the word evacuation. Priya caught her arm briefly at the base of the stairs. "Where are you going?" she said, breathless. "Third floor," Autumn said. "Pediatric wing needs help evacuating before anyone downstairs even finishes reading the memo." Priya did not argue. She had learned enough about this particular new hire in one single afternoon to understand that arguing would only cost time neither of them had. The pediatric wing sat on the hospital's 3rd floor, farthest from the ambulance bay and closest to the exterior wall that faced the docks, which meant it was the first place anyone with sense would want emptied if the wind carried anything worse than smoke across the water. Autumn reached it within 90 seconds of the alert, moving faster than the elevator, taking the stairs 2 at a time out of habit rather than decision. Inside, 10 children lay in various states of recovery, Lily among them, her small collarbone-braced mother dozing in a chair beside her bed. A young nurse named Denise stood frozen near the nurse's station, phone in hand, looking at the ceiling as though it might answer her questions for her. "Denise," Autumn said, sharp enough to cut through the woman's panic without raising her voice. "I need a head count. Names, conditions, mobility status, now." Denise blinked at her. "I do not know if we are supposed to move them yet," the announcement said. "Prepare, not evacuate. I was going to call downstairs." "We are not waiting for a phone call," Autumn said. "If that tanker goes, the smoke reaches this floor before anyone downstairs picks up. Head count, now." Something in her tone reached past Denise's panic and gave her something to hold on to besides fear. She nodded, grabbed the chart binder, and started calling out names, her voice steadying with each one, the simple discipline of the task pulling her back from the edge of her own fear. Autumn moved down the row of beds, assessing quickly, sorting in her head the way she had been trained to sort a decade earlier in rooms far more hostile than this one. 3 children on monitors that could not be easily disconnected, 2 on oxygen. Lily, recovering well enough to walk if guided. An infant in the corner easellette, barely a day old, born early that morning during the chaos downstairs, too fragile to be jostled without care. A boy of about 9, recovering from a fractured arm sustained in the same dock explosion that had brought half the ward its patients, sat up straight in his bed, watching Autumn with wide, frightened eyes. "Are we going to die?" he asked, the question so plain and unguarded that it stopped several nearby adults mid-motion. "No," Autumn said, crouching briefly to meet his eyes at his own level. "We are going to walk downstairs together, and it is going to feel like a fire drill. And afterward, you are going to tell everyone at school that you survived 2 disasters in one day, which nobody is going to believe, so you should probably get a photo." The boy almost laughed despite himself, some of the terror draining out of his shoulders, and Autumn moved on before he could ask another question she could not fully answer. An elderly grandmother, sitting with a toddler recovering from smoke inhalation, gripped Autumn's sleeve as she passed. "I cannot carry him and the oxygen tank both," she said, her voice cracking. "My hip, I cannot manage the stairs with both." "You will not have to," Autumn said. "Someone will carry the tank. You carry him. That is the job I am giving you, and it is the only one that matters right now." Thorne arrived 4 minutes later, out of breath, his earlier polish completely gone, replaced by something close to real fear. "What is the status?" he said, looking to Autumn first, an instinct he clearly had not chosen but could not help. 10 patients, Autumn said. 3 critical, 2 stable, 5 ambulatory with assistance. We need 3 isolettes down, 4 wheelchairs, and every spare set of hands on this floor in the next 2 minutes, or we move them by hand. Thorne looked around at the chaos, at children beginning to cry as their parents' fear became visible to them, and for a long moment he did nothing at all. The paralysis of a man whose entire career had trained him for scheduled crises and never for this one. His eyes moved from bed to bed, cataloging the danger without landing on a single actionable thought. The particular helplessness of a man accustomed to controlling every variable in a sterile operating room, and now faced with a hallway full of variables that refused to hold still. "Doctor," Autumn said, quieter now, almost gentle, the way she might have once steadied a young operator on his first mission. "I need you to take the isolette, the premature infant. I need someone I trust with steady hands to carry her personally down the stairwell, because the elevator is not an option if the power fails. Can you do that?" Something in the direct request, the calm assumption that he was capable, seemed to break through whatever had frozen him. He nodded, moved to the isolette, and gathered the tiny newborn with a care that surprised even himself, his hands finding a gentleness that his morning arrogance had never once suggested he possessed. Stone appeared in the doorway a moment later, 3 members of his team behind him, one still favoring the arm in a sling. "Heard you needed hands," he said. "I need every one of them," Autumn said, and did not waste a second on surprise that he had come. 2 of your men on the wheelchair patients, 1 on the stairwell doors, holding them open and clear. You, with me, on the critical monitor patients, we carry them together, chest and legs, minimal jostling. Stone did not question the instructions. He simply moved. The same instant obedience Autumn remembered from operators who trusted a commander's read of a room more than their own instincts. And for one strange, suspended moment, the years fell away, and she was exactly what she had once been, giving orders in a burning building with people who followed them without hesitation. Halfway through loading the first wheelchair, one of the portable monitors let out a sharp failing beep, its battery dying faster than expected under the strain of being disconnected and reconnected twice in the same afternoon. Autumn caught the sound instantly, crossed the room in 4 steps, and swapped the battery pack from a spare unit without breaking stride, the entire exchange taking less than 8 seconds. Denise stared at her. "How did you even hear that under all this noise?" "You learn to hear the sound that matters," Autumn said, already moving to the next bed. "Everything else is just noise." A second complication arrived almost immediately after. The floor's backup elevator, normally reserved for equipment transport, groaned to a stop between the 3rd and 2nd floors, its control panel flashing an error code that meant nothing to anyone standing in the hallway, except that the doors were not opening, and 2 staff members with a stretcher patient were now trapped inside a metal box during an act of evacuation. Autumn reached the elevator doors within seconds, pressing her palm flat against the cool metal and listening for a moment before speaking through the narrow gap where the doors had not fully sealed. "Can you hear me in there?" she called. A muffled voice confirmed they could, along with the patient's vitals, stable but frightened. "Do not force the doors," Autumn said. "And do not touch the emergency release panel. It will drop you the rest of the way instead of stopping you level. I need someone to manually crank the release from the machine room, not from inside the car." One of Stone's men, the one favoring his sling, appeared at her shoulder without being asked, already moving toward the maintenance access door down the hall. "Machine room override," he said. "I have done this on a transport vessel before. Give me 90 seconds. He returned in 70, and the elevator doors parted with a groan a moment later, the trapped stretcher rolling free into the hallway to considerable relieved applause from nearby staff. Autumn allowed herself exactly 2 seconds of relief before moving on to the next task, because 2 seconds was all the day had budgeted her for anything. The evacuation took 11 minutes, each one stretched taut with the sound of children crying, monitors beeping their disconnection warnings, and somewhere far below, the low groan of a structure absorbing pressure it was never designed to hold. Autumn led the youngest and most fragile down the stairwell herself, Stone at her shoulder carrying the opposite end of a gurney, Lily's small hand gripping the hem of Autumn's scrub top the entire way down because she had refused, point blank, to be carried by anyone else. Behind them, the grandmother descended slowly, one careful step at a time. The toddler clutched against her chest, a young member of Stone's team matching her pace exactly, one hand hovering near her elbow without ever quite touching her, ready to catch her the instant her hip gave out and never needing to. On the second-floor landing, a support beam near the stairwell door groaned audibly, dust sifting down from a hairline crack that had not existed that morning. Autumn's eyes went to it instantly, calculating angle and load the way she once calculated exit routes from compromised buildings. "Do not use this door," she said, redirecting the entire line of evacuees toward the far stairwell with a single raised arm and a voice that allowed no argument. "Second exit now, move." Nobody questioned her. Nobody had questioned her all morning, not since the moment her hands had stopped shaking. Denise, bringing up the rear of the line with the last of the ambulatory patients, hesitated at the redirected doorway. "Are you sure?" she asked. "The drill maps show this as the primary route. The drill maps were drawn before that beam had a crack in it," Autumn said. "Trust the beam, not the map." They cleared the building 40 seconds before the second tanker's containment finally failed, a smaller detonation than the first, more contained, more controlled, but close enough that the ground shuddered under 600 evacuated patients and staff standing in the parking lot, watching a second column of black smoke rise into the Savannah sky. Lily buried her face against Autumn's shoulder at the sound, and Autumn held her without hesitation, one hand cupped protectively around the back of the girl's head, the other still holding the strap of a monitor bag she had refused to let anyone else carry. Thorne stood 20 feet away, cradling the newborn Isolette against his chest, with a tenderness nobody on that floor had ever seen from him, staring at Autumn with an expression that had nothing left of arrogance in it at all. The 9-year-old boy with the fractured arm found his way to Autumn's side in the confusion, tugging at her sleeve. "Did we survive 2 disasters?" he asked, breathless. "You did," Autumn said. "Get that photo." Stone stepped up beside her, watching the smoke settle over the water. "That building would have lost people on that stairwell," he said quietly, "if you had let that line go through the door." "I read a lot of blueprints," Autumn said. Stone shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You read rooms. That is not the same skill, and it is not something charting software teaches anybody." Across the parking lot, Deborah Crane stood near a cluster of administrators, phone pressed to her ear, her earlier composure cracked wide open, shouting instructions to someone about liability forms and incident reports, as though paperwork could retroactively make the last 20 minutes make sense. She caught sight of Autumn holding Lily, of Thorne cradling the newborn, of Stone's team standing in a loose protective perimeter around the evacuated patients, and for the first time all day, she had absolutely nothing composed to say. By the time the fire department confirmed the second hazard fully contained, the sun had dropped low over the marsh, painting the parking lot in the kind of orange light that made the whole scene look like something staged for a film rather than something that had actually happened. The patients were moved into a temporary shelter set up in the hospital's east wing, spared by the evacuation route Autumn had chosen. Lily's mother, awake now and horrified to learn what had almost happened while she slept, would not stop thanking Autumn, gripping both of her hands and refusing to let go until Priya gently intervened. The 9-year-old boy with the fractured arm found his mother in the crowd of reunited families, and true to his word, someone produced a phone and took his photograph standing in front of the smoking skyline, grinning like a boy who had just won something instead of survived it. Autumn caught sight of the picture over his mother's shoulder and allowed herself for just a moment a real smile, the first uncomplicated one of the entire day. Stone found Autumn near the ambulance bay, sitting on the low concrete barrier, elbows on her knees, the adrenaline finally beginning to drain out of her in slow, exhausted waves. He sat down beside her without asking permission. "I made a call while you were on that stairwell," he said, "to someone who still has access to records most people cannot pull anymore." Autumn did not look at him. "You should not have done that." "Maybe not," Stone said, "but I needed to know if the woman who just moved 60 patients through a structural hazard without losing a single one was who I thought she was, or if I was chasing ghosts because it had been a long day. And Chief Petty Officer Autumn Reyes was reported administratively separated 3 years ago," Stone said quietly, choosing each word with the care of a man handling something fragile. "Call sign Sparrow. combat medic attached to a joint special operations task force, credited with keeping an extraction team alive during an engagement that went bad in ways the report only partially describes. I do not need the rest of it. I do not want it, unless you ever want to give it to me yourself. Autumn finally turned to face him, and for the first time since she had walked into Covenant Bay that morning, she let the exhaustion and the years show plainly on her face, without bracing herself to hide it. 3 of mine did not come home from that extraction, she said quietly. 2 men I had known since training. A third who made it home but was never quite the same afterward, and stopped answering my calls about a year later, which I understood, even if it still hurt every time the phone did not ring. I made the call to leave the service 2 weeks after the extraction. I did not think anyone outside a locked file would ever say that name again. I am not going to broadcast it, Stone said. But I think you should know something. My corpsman, the one who told me those old stories, he served under a sergeant who used to say Sparrow saved his platoon during a raid nobody talks about anymore. He never knew your face, only the call sign. Today, some of my men finally put a face to the story they grew up hearing in briefing rooms. Autumn absorbed that in silence for a moment, watching the last of the smoke thin out over the marsh. Tell him I am glad he made it home to have children of his own to tell those stories to eventually, she said finally. That is the only part of it that ever mattered. Stone was quiet for a moment, letting that settle. It is a strange thing, he said eventually, watching men come home and build ordinary lives after the kind of missions nobody outside a locked file ever hears about. Barbecues, little league games, mortgage payments, and underneath all of it, a version of them that still exists only in briefing rooms and classified reports, walking around inside their heads like a second person nobody else gets to meet. I know that version well, Autumn said quietly. I have been living next to mine for 3 years. Some days it is quiet. Today it was not. Does it get easier? Stone asked. Living next to it. It gets quieter, Autumn said. Not easier. There is a difference, and most people who have not lived it assume they are the same thing. Stone nodded slowly, filing that answer away the way a man files away something true and difficult that he does not fully know what to do with yet. For what it is worth, he said, the version of you that showed up today looked a lot more like command than like hiding. Autumn allowed herself a small, tired laugh, the first one all day that had nothing bitter underneath it. That might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me all day, she said. It has been a long day for kindness, Stone said. And for a moment they simply sat together in the fading light, 2 professionals who understood a version of exhaustion that most of the people around them, however kind, would never fully share. Behind them, the hospital's interim administrator, a soft-spoken man named Robert Alsop, standing in for the regional board while the fire investigation proceeded, approached with Thorne beside him, the surgeon's posture stripped of every trace of his morning arrogance. Before they reached her, Autumn caught a fragment of a separate, sharper conversation happening near the administration building. Deborah Crane stood with her arms crossed, facing Alsop's assistant, her voice pitched low but carrying in the strange quiet of the parking lot. I followed every protocol on my end, Crane was saying. If the fire marshal has questions about maintenance inspection timelines at the terminal, that is a city matter, not a hospital matter. The credentials review you scheduled for a nurse who saved 60 patients an hour ago is very much a hospital matter, the assistant replied, flat and unimpressed, and Crane's mouth closed around whatever she had been about to say next. There have been other complaints filed against your office this year, the assistant continued, checking something on a tablet. 3 nurses in the last 18 months who raised concerns about Dr. Thorne's conduct and were told the matter would be documented, then heard nothing further. A resident who resigned last spring citing an unaddressed harassment complaint. The board is going to want to understand why documentation seems to be where complaints against certain physicians go to disappear, Ms. Crane, and today's incident has made that question considerably harder to avoid. Crane's composure, so carefully maintained all afternoon, finally cracked at the edges. I have always prioritized the reputation of this hospital, she said, an edge of genuine defensiveness creeping into her practiced calm. The reputation of this hospital nearly included losing a ward full of children on a stairwell today, the assistant said, because the person managing that evacuation was not the surgeon this hospital protects, but a nurse whose credentials you were preparing to question for reasons that had nothing to do with her competence. The board will want a full account. I would begin preparing one now, rather than later. Crane did not respond, and for the first time since Autumn had arrived at Covenant Bay that morning, she saw the woman entirely out of words. Standing very still in the orange evening light, her blazer no longer looking quite like armor. Ms. Reyes, Alsop said, arriving at last, his tone entirely different from Crane's practiced warmth, something plainer and more sincere in it. I understand you led the pediatric evacuation, made the pneumothorax diagnosis in Bay 2 earlier today, and identified a structural hazard that likely saved multiple lives on that stairwell. Autumn stood, steady despite the hours behind her. I did my job, sir. Dr. Thorne has already submitted a full account of today's events, Alsop continued, glancing at Thorne, who did not look away this time, including a formal correction to an earlier complaint filed against you. Thorne stepped forward, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, the silence of a man rebuilding a sentence he had never needed to say before in his career. I was wrong about you, he said finally, quiet enough that it did not carry past the small circle of people standing there. This morning, and possibly for longer than that. I do not know what you were before you came to this hospital, and I am not sure it is my business to know. But I know what I saw today, and it was not a nurse who does not understand a bandage. Autumn studied him for a moment, the same steady gaze she had given him that morning, except now there was nothing left to prove. Apology accepted, doctor, she said. Try being that surgeon on an ordinary Tuesday too, not just on the day the docs blow up. Thorne almost smiled at that, a small, rueful expression that looked unfamiliar on his face, as though he had not used those particular muscles in years. Fair, he said. Alsop cleared his throat, glancing toward the administration building, where Deborah Crane stood watching from a distance, her earlier command of the situation entirely gone. I am also aware that a credentials review was scheduled for next week, following today's incident with Dr. Thorne's original complaint. Given the corrected account, and given that this hospital's board will be reviewing Ms. Crane's handling of several other personnel matters in light of today, I believe that review can be considered closed. It was as close to an apology as hospital administration would ever offer, and Autumn accepted it with a small nod, because there was nothing to be gained by asking for more. Priya appeared at Autumn's elbow, just as Alsop and Thorne moved off toward the shelter tents, exhaustion written into every line of her face, her scrubs stained in a dozen places. That was the longest first day I have ever seen anyone survive, Priya said. It was not the longest day I have ever survived, Autumn said, and something in her voice made Priya look up sharply, sensing the weight behind the sentence without needing it explained. You are not just a transfer from Charleston, are you? Priya said. It was not really a question. No, Autumn said, I am not. Priya studied her for a long moment, then simply nodded, the way a good charge nurse learns to accept a fact without needing to interrogate its edges. Whatever you were before, she said, you are a damn good nurse now. I will take that over a mystery any day. Autumn allowed herself a tired smile. That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me all day. Low bar, Priya said, and for the first time since the alarm had sounded, they both laughed, short and real, the kind of laughter that only survives on the far side of genuine fear. It felt strange to laugh at all after a day like this one, Priya admitted once the moment passed, wiping at her eyes with the back of her wrist. But I think we earned it. Every single person on this floor earned it. We did, Autumn agreed. Tomorrow we will go back to arguing about supply closets and broken vending machines. Tonight I think we are allowed this. Later that evening, once the shelter had quieted and most of the displaced patients had been moved to nearby facilities or cleared to go home, Autumn found herself back at the nurses' station, finishing the same charting she had abandoned hours earlier when the second alarm sounded. Alvarez passed by twice, clearly working up the courage to say something, and on the third pass, finally stopped. I do not know what you did back there, in Bay 2, he said, but I switched my specialty preference this afternoon. Trauma, not dermatology, just so you know who to blame. Autumn looked up at him properly for the first time all day. Good, she said. The world needs more people willing to stay calm when the numbers on the monitor stop making sense. Alvarez nodded, oddly moved by the small endorsement, and went back to his rounds looking, for the first time since she had met him that morning, like he belonged in the building. Stone appeared once more before his team departed for the night, standing a respectful distance from the nurse's station. My corpsman is stable, thanks to you, he said. He will make a full recovery. I wanted you to hear that from me directly, not from a chart. Thank you for telling me, Autumn said. Stone hesitated. Then he said the thing he had clearly been considering since the stairwell. If this hospital ever needs someone to run trauma drills, mass casualty protocols, the kind of training most civilian staff never get until the day they desperately need it, my unit does that kind of liaison work sometimes. I could put your name forward, only if you want it. Autumn considered it for a long moment, turning the offer over the way she once turned over mission parameters, weighing risk against purpose. "I am not going back into that life," she said finally. "Not the way it used to be, but I could teach it. Here, to people like Thorne, before the next disaster, not during one." Stone nodded, satisfied, and extended his hand. She shook it, and for a moment, the handshake held the full weight of two professionals recognizing each other clearly, without needing anything further explained between them. "I will send the paperwork through Alsop's office," Stone said. "Consider it a standing invitation, not a deadline." He left with his team an hour later, the sound of their transport fading into the ordinary noise of a hospital returning to routine. Autumn stayed behind, walked the quiet halls of the pediatric wing one last time before her shift technically ended, and stopped at Lily's new bed, where the girl was finally sleeping, her mother resting beside her, collarbone brace visible even in the dim light. She did not wake either of them. She only stood there a moment, watching the slow, even rise and fall of the child's breathing, the kind of quiet victory nobody would ever write into an after-action report. On the chart at the foot of Lily's bed, someone, probably Denise, had clipped a small drawing the girl must have made earlier that evening while waiting to be discharged, a crayon sketch of a woman in blue scrubs standing between a burning building and a row of stick-figure children, the woman's arms spread wide as though she could hold the whole scene together by sheer will alone. Underneath, in careful, uneven letters, Lily had written a single word: hero. Autumn looked at the drawing for a long moment, longer than she looked at almost anything that day, and did not touch it, though something in her chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. 3 years of hiding had taught her to disappear into rooms like this one, to be small and quiet and forgettable. Today had taught her something different, something she had almost forgotten in all that careful vanishing. She had never been hiding weakness inside those trembling hands that morning. She had been hiding command, waiting for a day terrible enough to need it again. Autumn turned off the hallway light behind her and walked toward the locker room to change out of scrubs that, for the first time since she had put them on, finally seemed to fit. Outside, the Savannah sky had gone fully dark, the smoke long since carried off by a shifting wind. The docks quiet again except for the flashing lights of fire crews finishing their overnight watch. Somewhere in that darkness, a hospital that had almost lost everything was already beginning, quietly and imperfectly, to become something a little better than it had been that morning. It would take more than one day to undo years of a chief surgeon's cruelty, or an administrator's convenient blindness, but a beginning was still a beginning, and Autumn Reyes, who understood better than most people what it cost to rebuild something broken, decided as she walked to her car that she was willing to stay and help this one heal too. The end. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe to Silent Badge's Stories, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in her place, because the next quiet nurse you meet might be hiding the same kind of courage.